Jake sat in his small scout ship and stared at the empty space around him, and he had been doing this job for 15 years now, and space always looked the same to him, and dark and empty and quiet. But today something was different, and his ship's sensors started making loud noises and warning lights flashed on every screen, and Jake leaned forward to check what was wrong, and his eyes went wide when he saw it. There was something floating in the debris field ahead, and it looked like a crystal pod, and it was spinning slowly and moving toward a dying star, and the star would pull it in soon, and whatever was inside would die, and Jake could see through the transparent walls of the pod, and there was someone inside, and she looked human, but also not human at all, and her hair was silver, and seemed to glow with its own light, and she was pressing her hands against the crystal wall, and around her was something impossible. A small creature with scales and wings wrapped around the woman and protecting her, and its eyes burned like gold fire, and Jake had seen many strange things in space, but never anything like this. And the creature looked like the dragons from old Earth stories and myths and legends, and Jake thought he must be dreaming, but his sensors said it was real, and the pod was losing air fast, and the woman inside would die in minutes. Jake did not think about what to do next, and his hands moved on the controls before his brain caught up, and he changed his ship direction and flew toward the crystal pod, and the computer warned him that this was dangerous and stupid and against regulations. But Jake did not care, and he had never let anyone die in space if he could help it, and he was not going to start now. Getting to the pod was the easy part, and stopping it from spinning was harder, and Jake used his rescue cables to grab the pod and slow it down, and then he pulled it into his cargo bay. And the whole process took 10 minutes, and every second the woman inside looked more desperate, and the dragon creature hissed and clawed at the crystal trying to break free. Once the pod was inside, Jake sealed the cargo bay and put on his space suit and grabbed his tools, and the crystal material was strange and did not cut like normal metal or plastic, and his regular tools did nothing to it, and Jake had to use plasma torches, and even then it took forever, and he could see the woman inside getting weaker and her eyes closing and the dragon making sad sounds. Finally the seal broke and air rushed into the pod, and the woman gasped and fell forward, and Jake caught her before she hit the floor, and she was light and cold, and her skin felt strange and smooth like polished stone, and the dragon creature jumped onto her shoulder and hissed at Jake, and showed tiny sharp teeth, and Jake held up his hands to show he meant no harm. The woman opened her eyes and looked at Jake, and her eyes were purple and bright like jewels, and she spoke in a language Jake did not understand at first, and then she switched to English, and her accent was strange but clear, and she said, "Please, and they are coming, and the hunters cannot find me," and her voice sounded like wind chimes or music. Jake looked past her through the broken pod and into space, and he saw lights in the distance, and ships were coming and fast ones, and his sensors confirmed they were military ships and heavily armed, and whoever was hunting this woman meant business, and Jake made a quick decision and sealed the cargo bay and ran to the pilot's seat and started his engines. The woman stumbled after him and held onto a wall, and the dragon stayed on her shoulder and watched Jake with those intelligent gold eyes. And the woman said, "You risk your life for a stranger. And why would you do this?" And Jake did not look back from his controls. And he said, "Where I come from, we help people who need help. And also, I really hate bullies." His ship was small and not built for fighting, but Jake had escaped dangerous situations before, and he knew how to fly, and he pushed his ship into an asteroid field. And the pursuing ships had trouble following, and Jake twisted and turned between the floating rocks, and used every trick he knew, and the enemy ships fired weapons, but missed, and Jake felt sweat on his forehead but kept flying. The woman watched him, and after a while she smiled, and it was a dangerous smile and full of old power, and she said, "My name is Princess Lyra Silverwing of the Celestial Reach, and you human have just made yourself the most wanted person in 3 galaxies." And Jake laughed and said, "Fantastic, and I always wanted to be famous." And the dragon made a sound that might have been laughter too. They flew for hours, and Jake kept changing direction, and using every hiding spot he could find, and the enemy ships kept searching, but eventually gave up and left, and Jake finally relaxed and looked at his passenger, and really looked at her for the first time, and she was beautiful in a way that seemed impossible and otherworldly, and not quite human. Lyra told him about her people while they traveled, and the Celestial Reach was an empire that spanned hundreds of worlds, and they had been hiding from humans for a long time and watching Earth from afar. And they had technology that humans could not imagine, and they were ancient and powerful, and considered themselves superior to younger races like humanity. She had been running from an arranged marriage, and not the romantic kind, but the political kind that ended in wars, and her intended husband was named Lord, and he commanded a military faction, and he wanted to destroy humanity before it became a threat, and Lyra refused to marry him, and that started a civil war. The queen tried to protect me, Lyra said, and but has many followers, and he accused me of treason, and said I was corrupted by humans, and the hunters you saw were his assassins, and they will not stop looking for me. And Jake listened, and understood that he had just gotten involved in something much bigger than a simple rescue. The dragon, whose name was Ember, curled up in Lyra's lap and made purring sounds, and Jake kept flying toward Earth, and hopping the defense systems would not shoot them down, and Lyra looked tired and scared and alone, and Jake felt sorry for her, and he said, "We will figure this out, and you are safe now." And Lyra looked at him with those purple eyes, and said, "You do not understand what you have done, and will come for me, and he will destroy anyone who helps me." Jake shrugged and said, "Then we better be ready for him." And Lyra stared at him like he was crazy, and maybe he was, but Jake had never been good at giving up, and he was not going to start now. And besides, something about this princess made him want to protect her, and not just because it was the right thing to do, but because she seemed worth protecting. They reached Earth orbit, and immediately defense satellites locked onto them and demanded identification. And Jake transmitted his security codes and explained he had a refugee who needed help, and the military did not believe him at first and threatened to shoot them down. And Jake had to argue for 20 minutes before they agreed to let him land. When they finally docked at the orbital station, soldiers surrounded them and pointed weapons and demanded Lyra surrender, and Ember hissed, and her scales started glowing, and Lyra held up her hands and said she would cooperate, and she would explain everything, and Jake stood beside her and refused to leave, and the soldiers looked confused but allowed it. They were taken to an interrogation room and kept there for 6 hours, and military officials asked the same questions over and over, and Lyra answered patiently and told them about the Celestial Reach and the Civil War and plans to wipe out humanity, and the officials did not want to believe her, but the evidence was hard to ignore. Jake sat beside Lyra the whole time, and Ember stayed in Lyra's lap, and eventually they were moved to better quarters and given food and water, and allowed to rest. And Lyra looked at Jake and said, "Thank you, and you did not have to stay with me." And Jake said, "Yes, I did, and someone has to make sure they treat you right." That night Jake could not sleep, and he kept thinking about what Lyra had said, and about his fleet, and about the war that was coming, and he wondered if saving one person had just doomed his whole planet. And then he thought about Lyra's eyes and her courage and her refusal to marry someone evil, and he decided it was worth it. In the morning, alarms started screaming, and Jake ran to find Lyra, and she was already at the window, and Ember was on her shoulder, and they were looking out at space, and Jake followed their gaze and felt his blood turn cold. Space was tearing open, and ships were coming through, and lots of ships, and they were beautiful and deadly, and covered in strange symbols, and they surrounded the station, and Jake knew without being told that had found them, and the war Lyra warned about was starting right now. Lyra turned to Jake, and her face was pale, and she said, "He found me, and he will destroy this entire station to get to me, and we have to run." And Jake grabbed her arm and said, "No, and we fight." And Lyra said, "You cannot fight him, and you do not understand." And Jake smiled and said, "Then teach me and show me how to fight." And Lyra stared at him and then slowly smiled back. They ran together toward the hangar, and Ember flew ahead of them, and Jake had a crazy plan forming in his mind, and it probably would not work, but he had to try, and Lyra stayed close to him and trusted him, and that trust meant more to Jake than he could explain, and together they were going to face an army and probably die, but at least they would go down fighting. The station shook as enemy weapons hit the shields and alarms screamed everywhere, and soldiers ran to battle stations, and Jake and Lyra reached the hangar, and Jake pointed to his ship and said, "Get in, and we are going to do something stupid," and Lyra laughed and said, "I am starting to understand humans, and stupid plans are your specialty," and Jake grinned and said, "You have no idea." The meeting room was full of angry people and generals and politicians and scientists, and they all wanted to know what to do about Lyra, and some wanted to send her back, and some wanted to keep her and study her, and some wanted to use her as a bargaining chip, and Jake sat in the corner and listened and got angrier with every word. Lyra sat calmly in the center of the room, and Ember was in her lap, and the dragon glared at everyone who spoke too loudly, and Jake noticed that the room got colder whenever Ember was upset, and maybe the little dragon had powers beyond just looking scary and breathing fire. General Kate Foster was in charge of Earth defense, and she was a hard woman with sharp eyes, and she did not like complications, and Lyra was the biggest complication Earth had ever seen, and Foster leaned forward and said, "Explain to me why we should risk billions of human lives for one alien princess," and Lyra did not flinch, and her voice stayed steady. "Because will not stop with me, and he believes humanity is a disease, and he wants to wipe you out before you spread further into space. And I am the only thing standing between your species and an enemy you cannot comprehend," and Lyra said this without emotion, and like she was discussing the weather, and the room went quiet. Jake spoke up from his corner and said, "She is telling the truth, and I saw their ships, and our weapons will not even scratch them," and Foster turned to look at Jake and said, "So, what do we do, Commander, and surrender?" And Jake shook his head and said, "No, we learn and we adapt and we fight." Lyra looked at Jake, and something soft appeared in her expression, and she turned back to Foster and said, "I propose an alliance, and teach me about human tactics, and your refusal to give up, and in return, I will teach you about Reach technology and their weaknesses, and how to make them bleed." The room erupted, and everyone talked at once, and some said it was impossible, and some said it was their only chance, and some said they needed more time to think, and Foster held up her hand for silence and said, "We will take this under advisement, and Princess Lyra, you will remain here under guard, and the meeting is over." After everyone left, Jake followed Lyra to her quarters, and they were nice quarters, but still felt like a prison, and there were guards outside and cameras everywhere, and Lyra sat on the bed and looked tired, and Ember curled up beside her, and Jake leaned against the wall and said, "That went well." Lyra laughed, but it was a sad sound, and she said, "You should not have saved me, and I have brought you nothing but trouble," and Jake shrugged and said, "Trouble and I are old friends, and besides, you said it yourself, and I have this annoying human trait where I refuse to quit." She looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "You are not what I expected, and the Reach teaches us that humans are primitive and emotional and short-lived and stupid. But you saw a stranger dying and did not hesitate, and you risked everything for someone you did not know. Maybe your Reach has been looking at the wrong humans," and Jake said, and Lyra started to reply. But then the alarms went off, and they were loud and urgent, and Ember jumped to the window, and her scales flared with light, and Jake ran to look, and his heart sank. Space was tearing open again, and this time it was worse, and more ships came through, and dozens of them, and they were bigger than before and surrounded the entire station. And Lyra stood beside Jake and whispered, "He found me, and he will destroy everything." The communication systems activated, and a face appeared on every screen, and he was handsome in a cold way, and his eyes were like ice, and his voice was smooth and cruel. And he said, "Princess Lyra and Commander, and your resistance is pointless, and surrender now." Jake looked at Lyra and saw fear in her eyes, and real fear, and he understood that was not just powerful but terrifying. And Lyra had been running from him for so long, and now he was here, and there was nowhere left to run. But Jake had an idea, and it was crazy and probably suicidal, but all his best ideas were. And he grabbed Lyra's hand and said, "Come with me and trust me," and Lyra looked at their joined hands, and then at his face, and she nodded, and they ran. They ran through corridors while the station shook, and soldiers rushed past them, and Jake led Lyra to the hangar, and his ship was still there. And he started explaining his plan while they climbed aboard, and Lyra's eyes went wide, and she said, "That is insane, and it will never work," and Jake grinned and said, "Probably, but it is all we have got." The plan was simple and stupid and brilliant, and they would take Lyra's damaged escape pod and fill it with explosives, and let ships capture it thinking she was inside, and then detonate it when they dropped their shields, and the explosion would cripple his fleet and give Earth forces a chance. Lyra said, "This requires me to trust you completely," and Jake said, "Yes, it does," and Lyra stared at him, and then said, "I do trust you, and I do not know why, but I do," and they started working, and Ember helped by carrying tools in her mouth, and the little dragon seemed to understand what they were doing. It took 2 hours to prepare everything, and by then the battle had started, and Earth ships were fighting fleet and losing badly, and the enemy shields were too strong and their weapons too powerful, and humans were dying, and Jake felt sick but kept working. When everything was ready, they launched the pod and made it look like Lyra was trying to escape, and ships immediately broke formation to chase it, and Jake watched from his hidden position and held his breath, and beside him, Lyra was tense and Ember growled low and dangerous. The enemy ships surrounded the pod and started pulling it in, and their shields dropped just enough to allow the pod through, and Jake pressed the detonation button, and the universe turned white. The explosion was massive and beautiful and terrible, and 3 capital ships vanished in fire, and 2 more were crippled and spinning out of control, and the enemy fleet was in chaos, and Earth forces did not waste the opportunity and attacked hard and fast. Jake flew his ship into the battle, and Lyra sat beside him and directed him where to shoot and how to avoid enemy fire, and Ember somehow made the ship weapons more powerful, and Jake did not understand how but did not question it, and together they were deadly. They destroyed 2 enemy fighters and damaged a cruiser, and Jake felt alive in a way he had not felt in years, and beside him Lyra was fierce and focused and beautiful, and he realized he was falling for her, and that was probably stupid given the circumstances, but he could not help it. The battle raged for 17 minutes, and it felt like hours, and Jake's ship took damage but kept flying, and Lyra kept giving orders, and Ember kept making their weapons stronger, and slowly, impossibly, they were winning, and the enemy fleet was retreating. And then everything changed, and reality screamed, and space tore open wider than before, and through it came a ship that made everything else look like toys, and it was massive and covered in glowing symbols and radiating power that made Jake's sensors shut down. A woman appeared on every screen, and she was impossibly beautiful and looked like Lyra, but older and harder and colder, and her presence filled the entire battlefield, and everyone stopped fighting, and Jake knew, without being told, that this was the Queen and Lyra Mother. Seraphine Silverwing looked at the battlefield, and her voice reached everywhere, and she said, "This ends now," and ships immediately powered down and retreated, and human ships did the same, and Jake could barely breathe under the weight of her presence. The Queen looked directly at the station where Lyra stood beside Jake, and she said, "My daughter, and you have been found, and it seems you have found yourself protectors," and Lyra straightened, and said, "Mother, I will not marry," and Seraphine held up a hand, and said, "You will not need to." The Queen turned her gaze to Jake, and he felt like she was looking into his soul, and she said, "Commander Jake of Earth, and you saved my daughter, and you sheltered her, and you fought for her," and Jake swallowed, and said, "Just doing what was right." Right, and Seraphine repeated the word like it was strange, and she said, "Let it be known across all space and all dimensions, and Jake is under my personal protection, and he is declared a friend of the crown, and any who harm him answer to me." Jake felt the weight of those words and felt millions of eyes suddenly aware of him, and Lyra gasped and said, "Mother, do you know what you have done?" And Seraphine smiled slightly and said, "I understand perfectly." Furthermore, and the queen continued, "And I claim him as kin friend to the royal house, and he has earned our debt." And Lyra stared, and Jake did not understand what that meant, but it sounded important. Seraphine turned to where Fleet waited and said, "And you have lost, and your betrothal is ended, and your warmongering is exposed, and leave now or face my judgment." And the enemy ships vanished without another word. The queen looked once more at Jake and Lyra, and said, "Daughter, you have found your own path, and walk it well, and commander, we will meet again." And then she was gone and her massive ship, and left behind a battlefield full of confused people. Lyra turned to Jake and said, "Do you understand what my mother just did? And she claimed you as kin friend, and made you untouchable and bound you to our house. And she essentially adopted you." And Jake blinked and said seriously. Lyra laughed, and it was shaky, and said, "She also made you one of the most important humans alive. And she approved of my choice to trust you and to fight beside you, and the Civil War is not over, but everything has changed." Jake asked, "What happens now?" And Lyra looked at Earth spinning below and at the stars beyond, and said, "Now, we prepare, because we'll not surrender, and he will come back with allies. And when he does, we must be ready." Jake said, "We will be ready together." And Lyra smiled and took his hand and said, "Together. And though I should warn you that befriending a princess leads to complicated situations." Jake laughed and said, "My life became complicated when I rescued a glowing pod in space, and might as well see where this goes." And Lyra squeezed his hand and said, "I am glad you did." Around them, the station was recovering, and soldiers were helping the wounded, and repair crews were fixing damage, and Earth had just fought its first war with aliens and survived, and everything would change now. But Jake and Lyra stood together and watched the Queen ship vanish, and both understood something had shifted, and not just between their peoples, but between them, and something neither could name yet, but both felt. Ember chirped happily and settled on Lyra's shoulder and looked smug, and Jake reached over to pet the little dragon, and Ember allowed it, and even purred, and Jake thought maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. 3 months passed, and Earth changed in ways nobody could have imagined, and Lyra insisted on sharing Reach technology openly, and the military intelligence people were horrified. But the Queen supported her daughter, and what Seraphine wanted usually happened. Jake found Lyra in the training room, and she was fighting holographic opponents, and sweat made her silver hair dark, and Ember dozed on a nearby console, and one eye stayed open to watch for danger, and the little dragon never fully relaxed. "You push yourself too hard," and Jake said from the doorway, and Lyra finished a complicated move that would have broken bones and shut down the program, and she wiped her face and said, "We do not have time for rest," and is recruiting. Jake handed her water and said, "Recruiting who?" And Lyra drank and said, "Everyone who fears humanity, and the Void Syndicate, and the Stellar Dominion, and even the Hive Collective, and he is building a coalition based on terror. Because we are so scary." And Jake said, "And we have barely left our own solar system." And Lyra looked at him seriously and said, "That is exactly why you are terrifying." She explained while they walked to the cafeteria, and the Reach took 10,000 years to expand beyond their home, and humanity did it in decades, and human technology advanced impossibly fast, and humans adapted to everything. And Jake, we took ships my people built for centuries, and you found weaknesses in days. "Is that what scares?" And Jake asked. "And that we learn fast." And Lyra said, "What scares is that you do not stay in your place, and every race the Reach encountered either stopped growing or destroyed themselves, and you just keep pushing and trying and refusing to accept limits." Jake was quiet and then said, "Is that what you see in us and in me?" And Lyra stopped walking and looked at him and said, "I see people who looked at the stars and called them a challenge. And I see a man who saved a stranger because it was right, and I see what the Reach could have been." Before Jake could answer, alarms went off, and they ran to the command center, and General Foster was already there coordinating with officers across Earth. And the holographic display showed what everyone feared: and dimensional rifts opening, and an armada coming through. 60 capital ships, and Foster said grimly, and not just Reach designs and Dominion dreadnoughts and Syndicate carriers, and Hive war spheres, and brought friends. He brought an extermination fleet, and Lyra said, and her voice was hollow, and that is enough power to sterilize a planet, and he plans to make an example of Earth. The command center went silent, and everyone knew they were outmatched, and even with 3 months of upgrades they could not win, and it would be a massacre. Options, and Foster asked, and someone said evacuation and get people off-world, and another said they will just hunt us, and if Earth falls, humanity dies. Jake watched Lyra and saw her thinking and calculating and rejecting every option, and then something changed in her face, and she looked like it hurt, and she said, "There is one way. I surrender," and she said quietly and publicly before both peoples, and gets me, and in exchange he leaves Earth alone. No, and Jake said immediately, and Lyra said it is the only way to save everyone, and Jake said no again and louder, and we do not trade lives, and we do not surrender, and we do not let bullies win. This is not about pride, and Lyra said, and this is survival, and Jake stepped closer, and said it is both, and you think your mother made me kin friend to hand you over when things got hard, and you think humans survived this long by quitting. Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and she said then, "What do you suggest?" And some miracle that defies logic, and Jake turned to Foster and said, "How long until they arrive?" And Foster said, 16 hours. "Then we have 16 hours to do what humans do best," and Jake said, "and we improvise." The plan formed slowly, and everyone contributed, and it was madness. But madness was all they had, and Jake proposed something no sane commander would try, and instead of defending they would attack, and every ship Earth had would be armed and sent out with one order, and find a target and hurt it. There is no coordination, and an admiral protested, and no battle plan, and it is chaos, and Jake said exactly. And they know organized warfare, and they can counter structured defense, but chaos is new to them. Lyra added her own idea, and she would use her mother public claim and challenge directly, and it was an ancient Reach tradition and trial by combat, and if won he could take her, and if Jake won Earth went free. "If I win," and Jake said, "and I am not qualified to fight an immortal warrior," and Lyra said, "You will not be alone," and Ember growled agreement, and Jake understood the dragon would fight beside him. They had 16 hours, and everyone worked, and ships were armed and pilots briefed, and the combat arena was prepared, and Jake trained with Lyra, and she taught him how Reach warriors fought, and their patterns and weaknesses. "You fight with honor," and Lyra said, "and they expect honor, and so fight dirty, and use everything," and Jake grinned and said fighting dirty is something humans excel at. The hours passed too fast, and Jake tried not to think about dying, and tried not to think about Lyra's face if he lost, and tried to focus on the fight ahead, and Lyra stayed close and checked his armor again and again. "This armor I built for you," and she said, touching the plates, "and it is human engineering and Reach materials, and light but strong, and it will protect you." And Jake covered her hand with his, and said, "I know, and I trust you." Ember climbed onto Jake's shoulder and chirped and rubbed against his face, and the little dragon had grown to trust him, and even like him, and Jake scratched under her chin and said, "You better help me out there," and Ember purred. The fleet arrived exactly on time, and so many ships that they blocked the stars, and face appeared everywhere, and he was handsome and cold and full of contempt, and he said, "Surrender, and I will make your deaths quick." "Counter-proposal," and Jake said, and his voice did not shake, "and single combat, and you and me, and right to challenge witnessed by everyone, and or are you afraid to face a primitive human?" The insult worked, and face flickered with anger, and then he smiled and said, "Very well, and I will personally end the human who corrupted you, princess, and then I will end you." The arena was chosen, and a neutral station broadcast to billions, and Jake stood in the center wearing his armor and Lyra stood at the edge with Ember, and both looked terrified and Jake tried to look confident. Arrived in full battle armor and carrying weapons that hummed with power, and he was taller and faster and stronger, and enhanced by centuries of genetic improvement, and by every measure Jake was about to die. The fight started and moved faster than Jake could see, and his blade cut the air and left glowing trails, and Jake survived the first 30 seconds on pure instinct, and dodging by fractions and his heart hammered. Then Jake stopped trying to match speed and started thinking like a human, and he fought dirty and kicked dust, and threw debris, and targeted weak points Lyra had shown him, and when expected honor Jake gave him pragmatism. Was a master of formal combat and Jake was a survivor who learned to fight where rules did not matter, and every time prepared a perfect strike. Jake did something unexpected and rolled instead of blocking and attacked, instead of defending and laughed when he should have been afraid. "What are you?" and snarled after Jake landed a hit that cracked his helmet, and Jake gasped and bled from a dozen wounds, but said stubborn and really, really stubborn. The fight lasted 7 minutes and felt like forever, and Jake was losing and knew it, and was too fast and too strong, and one more hit would end it, and raised his blade for the killing blow. An ember launched from Lyra's shoulder and slammed into face, and the little dragon was small but fierce, and her claws found eyes, and he stumbled and broke his concentration. Jake's fist, enhanced by his armor, caught in the chest, and the Reach Lord flew backward, and hit the wall hard enough to crack metal, and silence fell across the battlefield. Rose slowly and his armor smoked, and his face showed disbelief and blood ran from his nose, and he said, "You cannot," and Jake interrupted, and said, "I already did, and now honor your word and leave Earth alone." For a moment looked ready to refuse, and to order the destruction of everything, and then the Queen ship appeared between Earth and the Coalition, and massive and terrible and seraphine voice carried everywhere. "And you lost in honorable combat, and by the oldest laws you are bound, and will you honor your oath or prove yourself oath breaker before witnesses?" Face twisted with rage and humiliation, and but with the Queen watching and his allies uncertain, he had no choice, and he said through gritted teeth, "I acknowledge defeat, and Earth is spared." The Coalition fleet began withdrawing, and some reluctant, and some relieved, and as the last ships vanished, collective relief swept through human space. But celebration stopped when Seraphine's ship approached, and the Queen appeared in holographic form and studied Jake and Lyra, and might have been approving. "My daughter and commander, and you force the old powers to acknowledge humanity will not be dismissed, and the Reach formally recognizes Earth as sovereign territory, and furthermore, I propose an alliance between our peoples." "Mother, the council will never," and Lyra started, and Seraphine interrupted gently, and said the council will obey their queen, and we stop treating younger species as threats, and start treating them as the future, and her gaze fixed on Jake. "You proved human worth in combat and honor, and few can claim such," and Seraphine said, and Jake, exhausted and bleeding, managed a smile, and said, "Does this mean I get upgraded from kin friend to something more ceremonial?" Seraphine actually laughed and said, "It means you are now the bridge between civilizations, and how you walk that path is up to you and my daughter," and she glanced between them, and for the first time looked almost mischievous. "Though I suspect you will walk it together, and am I wrong?" and Lyra took Jake's hand, and Ember chirped, and Lyra said, "No, mother, and you are not wrong." "Good," and Seraphine said, "and let this day mark not just survival, but the beginning of something greater, and an alliance between species and between worlds and between friends." When she vanished, silence fell, and then from Earth and every colony celebration erupted, and they survived, and they won, and they gained allies. Jake looked at Lyra and said, "What do we do now?" and Lyra smiled, tired but real, and said, "Now, we rebuild and we learn, and we show the galaxy that different species can thrive together." "That's simple," and Jake asked, and Lyra said, "That complicated?" But I learned from humans that worthwhile things usually are, and she squeezed his hand. And I learned from one human that sometimes the impossible just needs someone stubborn enough to try. Below them earth turned and small and fragile, and refusing to surrender, and above them stars waited and full of danger and wonder, and now full of friends. The war was stopped, and the alliance forged, and Jake, who thought his life would be routine, had become the man who united worlds. The weeks after the battle were strange and busy, and Jake barely had time to sleep, and everywhere he went people wanted to meet him and shake his hand and thank him for saving Earth, and he was not comfortable with fame, and preferred his quiet life, but that was gone now. Lyra stayed close and helped him navigate the attention, and she understood what it felt like to be thrust into spotlight. And Ember seemed to enjoy the attention and preened whenever cameras pointed at them, and the little dragon had become something of a celebrity herself. The alliance between Earth and the Celestial Reach moved forward faster than anyone expected, and Seraphine sent ambassadors and teachers and engineers. And they brought technology that seemed like magic and gravity manipulation and energy shields, and faster than light engines that actually worked. Jake was appointed as liaison between species, and he had no training for diplomacy, but Foster said nobody else had his experience. And besides, the Reach respected him, and Lyra worked beside him, and together they built bridges. They worked long hours in an office overlooking Earth, and Jake learned about Reach culture and politics and history, and Lyra learned about human art and music and literature. And they traded stories and laughed and slowly became friends. And then something more. Ember noticed first, and the dragon started sleeping between them when they worked late and would chirp happily when they sat close. And once Jake found Lyra asleep at her desk and covered her with his jacket, and Ember looked at him with knowing eyes. One night they stood on the observation deck and watched stars, and Jake said, "Do you miss your home?" And Lyra was quiet, and then said, "I miss what it could have been, and not what it was. And the Reach is beautiful but cold and bound by tradition, and I like it here where people dream of impossible things." Jake turned to look at her, and her silver hair glowed in starlight, and she was beautiful and sad and strong. And he said, "You can stay as long as you want, and Earth is your home now if you want it." And Lyra smiled and said, "I think I do want it." She moved closer, and their shoulders touched, and Ember purred from her perch nearby. And Lyra said, "Thank you, Jake, and for everything, and for saving me and believing in me, and for showing me what humans can be." And Jake said, "You showed me what we could become." They stood like that for a long time, and neither wanted to break the moment. And outside the window Earth turned and peaceful and protected, and above them the stars waited. But peace never lasts, and 3 months after the battle warning, klaxons shattered the quiet, and Jake and Lyra ran to the command center and found chaos, and Foster was shouting orders and officers scrambled. "What happened?" and Jake demanded, and Foster pointed at the display and said, "Is back, and he brought more friends, and this time he means to finish what he started." The screen showed ships, and so many ships, and not just the coalition from before, but new fleets and mercenary groups and pirate clans, and anyone could hire or threaten, and they outnumbered the first attack by 3-1. "He is not taking chances," and Lyra said, and her face was pale, "and he will destroy Earth and everyone on it." And Jake felt cold fear, but pushed it down, and said, "Then we stop him." And Lyra said, "How?" and "We barely survived last time." Jake looked at the display and thought hard, and the enemy had numbers and power, but humans had something else, and they had stubbornness and creativity and refusal to accept defeat, and also they had 3 months to prepare. He turned to Foster and said, "Activate the contingency plan." And Foster's eyes widened and said, "That is not ready, and it is untested." And Jake said, "We are out of time, and do it now." Foster hesitated and then nodded and gave orders, and across Earth and its colonies and every station humanity had built alarms sounded, and a recorded message played, and it was Jake's voice, and saying, "This is not a drill, and all civilians to shelters, and all defense forces to stations, and prepare for attack. The contingency plan was something Jake and Lyra had designed together, and if the coalition attacked again, humanity would not fight alone, and the Reach had promised support and Queen Seraphine had given her word, and now was the time to test if that word meant anything. Lyra activated her communicator and broadcast on Reach frequencies, and said, "Mother, I call upon our alliance and Earth needs help." And there was silence and Jake's heart sank, and maybe the Queen had changed her mind, and maybe they were alone. Then space tore open, and through dimensional rifts came ships and Reach ships and dozens of them, and beautiful and deadly, and bearing the Queen personal insignia, and Seraphine voice echoed across all channels. "My daughter called and I answer, and let it be known that Earth stands under Reach protection, and any who attack them attack me." The enemy fleet hesitated and had not expected this, and his plan relied on catching Earth alone and vulnerable, and now he faced not just humans but the full might of the Reach throne. Face appeared on screens and he looked furious and desperate, and said, "Seraphine, you cannot protect them forever, and they are a threat to all civilized species, and they must be stopped." The Queen replied, and her voice was cold and terrible, and said, "Lord, you were given a chance to retreat with honor, and you chose war, and so war you shall have. But know that you fight not primitive humans but an alliance, and we will show you what that means." The battle began, and it was bigger than anything Jake had ever seen, and hundreds of ships on each side and weapons. Fire lit up space like fireworks, and Jake was in his ship with Lyra beside him and Ember in the back, and they flew into the chaos. The contingency plan had other elements too, and human ships now had Reach shields and weapons and enhanced engines, and they were still outmatched but not helpless, and they fought with desperate courage, and Reach ships covered them and protected them, and together they held the line. Jake flew through the battle and targeted enemy weak points, and Lyra guided him and called out threats, and Ember somehow made their weapons stronger, and they destroyed fighter after fighter and damaged a cruiser. Around them, the battle raged and ships exploded and debris filled space and people died, and Jake tried not to think about the casualties and focused on flying and surviving and protecting Lyra. A massive enemy dreadnought appeared and targeted the command station and fired, and the shot would have destroyed it and killed thousands. But a Reach battleship moved between and took the hit, and its shields flared and held and returned fire, and the dreadnought broke apart. Humans and Reach working together and covering each other and fighting as one, and it was beautiful and terrible, and Jake realized this was what the Alliance meant, and not just sharing technology but standing together. The battle turned slowly, and the enemy had numbers, but the Alliance had coordination and determination, and superior technology, and forces began retreating and taking heavy losses, and morale broke. Himself tried to flee and his flagship turned to run, but Lyra saw him and said there, "And do not let him escape," and Jake pushed his engines and chased. They caught up and Jake fired and damaged engines, and the flagship slowed and stopped and hailed them, and his face was twisted with hatred, and said, "You have won nothing, and this war will continue until humanity is wiped out." Lyra replied, and her voice was sad, and said, "You were my friend once, and what happened to you, and what made you so full of hate?" Laughed, and it was bitter, and said, "I saw the future and humans spreading and consuming and destroying, and I tried to stop it, but you chose them over your own people, and you are a traitor." Lyra said, "I chose conscience over fear, and I chose hope over hate, and you are the traitor, and you betrayed everything the Reach stands for." Reach ships surrounded, and he was captured, and his remaining forces surrendered, and the battle ended, and casualties were heavy on both sides, but Earth survived and the Alliance held. In the aftermath, Jake and Lyra returned to the station, and they were exhausted and covered in sweat and minor injuries, and Ember was tired and curled up and slept, and they sat together in quiet. "You saved us again," and Lyra said softly, and Jake shook his head and said, "We saved each other, and your mother saved us, and the Alliance saved us," and Lyra smiled and said, "Yes, I suppose it did." Foster found them and said the Queen wants to speak with you both, and they went to the communication room and Seraphine hologram appeared, and she looked tired but pleased. My daughter and commander, and you have proven that this alliance is not just words, but reality, and today humans and Reach fought together and bled together and won together. And she paused, and I am proud of you both. Thank you, Mother, and Lyra said, and Seraphine continued and will face trial for his crimes, and his followers are scattering, and the threat is ended. But there will be others, and there will always be those who fear change, and you must remain vigilant. We will, and Jake promised, and Seraphine smiled, and said, I believe you will, and she looked at Lyra, and said, Daughter, you have found your place. And I am glad, and she looked at Jake, and said, Commander, you have become more than kin friend, and you are family now. The Queen signed off, and Jake and Lyra sat in silence and processed everything. And finally Lyra said, What happens now? And we have won, and is defeated, and the alliance is strong, and Jake said, Now we build. Build what? And Lyra asked, and Jake gestured to the window, and to Earth and the stars beyond, and said everything in a future where humans and Reach work together, and where other species join us, and where we explore and learn and grow. Lyra took his hand and said, I like that future, and Jake squeezed her hand and said, Me too, and they sat together and watched Earth turn, and both felt hope and peace, and the knowledge that they had found something rare. Love was not mentioned yet, and both were too careful and too aware of complications. But it was there and growing, and Ember knew, and the little dragon chirped happily. The war was over, and the alliance was real, and Jake and Princess Lyra Silverwing had become symbols of what was possible. And the story of the princess saved by a human and the queen who claimed him was just beginning. 6 months after defeat, the alliance grew stronger, and more species joined, and not just Reach and humans, but others who saw hope in cooperation, and the Stellar Dominion sent ambassadors, and the Void Syndicate opened trade, and even the Hive Collective expressed interest. Jake spent his days in meetings and negotiations, and helping different species understand each other, and it was exhausting but rewarding, and he was building something that would last, and Lyra worked beside him, and they made a good team. Ember had grown and was now the size of a large dog, and her scales shone brighter, and she could breathe fire hot enough to melt steel, but she was still gentle with Jake and Lyra, and purred when they petted her and protected them fiercely. The command center had become a hub, and humans and Reach and others worked side by side, and at first there were misunderstandings and conflicts, but slowly they learned and adapted, and friendships formed. Jake watched it all and felt proud, and he remembered the scared woman in the crystal pod, and the desperate escape, and the impossible battle, and everything had changed since then, and especially him. Lyra found him on the observation deck one evening, and she often did, and it had become their place, and where they came to think and talk and be together, and she sat beside him, and Ember curled up between them. You look thoughtful, and Lyra said, and Jake smiled and said, just remembering, and how all this started, and how I almost did not rescue you, and what if I had flown past, and Lyra touched his arm and said, but you did not, and you saved me and changed everything. Do you ever regret it? And Jake asked, and leaving your home and your life, and everything you knew? And Lyra was quiet, and then said, no, and I regret nothing. And this life is better, and here I am free to choose and to be myself. She turned to face him, and her purple eyes were serious, and said, Jake, I need to tell you something, and I have been afraid to say it, but I cannot stay silent anymore. And Jake's heart raced, and said, what is it? I love you, and Lyra said simply, and I think I have loved you since you rescued me, and since you fought for me, and refused to give up, and I know it is complicated, and I know there are rules and expectations, but I needed you to know. Jake stared at her, and his mind went blank, and then filled with joy, and he said, I love you too, and I have for months, and I was afraid to say anything, and afraid you did not feel the same. And Lyra laughed, and it was bright and happy, and said, we are both fools then. They kissed, and it was gentle and sweet and perfect, and Ember chirped happily and nuzzled them both, and when they pulled apart, they were both smiling, and Jake said, "So, what do we do now?" And Lyra said, "We keep building and we keep fighting for this alliance, and we do it together." The weeks that followed were busy, but Jake and Lyra found time for each other, and they were not hiding their relationship. But they were not announcing it either, and people noticed anyway, and whispers spread. General Foster called them to her office, and she looked stern and said, "I am going to ask you both a question and be honest. And are you two involved?" And Jake and Lyra exchanged glances and said yes, and Foster sighed and said, "I thought so." She leaned back and said, "I should tell you it is a bad idea, and that it complicates things, and that people will talk." And Jake said, "We know," and Foster held up her hand and said, "I am not finished, but I am not going to stop you, and you two have earned the right to be happy, and also you work better together anyway." "Thank you, General," and Lyra said, and Foster smiled slightly and said, "Just do not let it interfere with your duties, and also congratulations," and they left feeling lighter. The Queen found out soon after, and Seraphine called Lyra privately, and Jake waited nervously outside. And when Lyra emerged, she was smiling and said, "Mother approves," and she said, "You have chosen well." And Jake let out breath he did not know he was holding. Life settled into a new normal, and the alliance expanded, and trade routes opened, and cultural exchanges began, and humans learned from Reach, and Reach learned from humans, and the galaxy changed. But not everyone was happy, and there were still those who feared change, and who wanted the old ways, and resistance movements formed and attacked alliance targets, and Jake and Lyra worked to counter them. One attack hit close, and a bomb exploded at a cultural center, and killed 12 people and 3 humans, and 6 Reach and 3 from other species, and the alliance mourned together. Jake spoke at the memorial, and he was not good at speeches, but he spoke from the heart, and said these people died building bridges and creating understanding, and we honor them by continuing their work, and by refusing to let fear win. Beside him, Lyra held his hand, and her face was sad, but determined, and Ember sat at their feet and looked fierce, and the crowd listened, and many cried, but they also felt resolve. The resistance was found and dismantled, and its leaders arrested and tried, and the alliance justice system worked and showed that laws applied to everyone and that rights were protected. Time passed and seasons changed, and the alliance first anniversary arrived, and there was a celebration, and ships from dozens of species gathered, and dignitaries gave speeches, and everyone celebrated. Jake and Lyra stood together and watched, and Lyra said, "We did this, and we built something beautiful," and Jake said, "We had help, and a lot of help," and Lyra nodded and said, "Yes, but we started it, and that matters." Queen Seraphine attended, and she rarely left her throne world, but she came for this, and she gave a speech about unity and hope and the future, and she looked at Jake and Lyra and smiled. After the ceremony, the Queen asked to speak with them privately, and they went to a quiet room, and Seraphine studied them, and said, "I have a question, and what are your intentions?" Jake and Lyra looked at each other, and Jake said, "We want to keep doing this work, and building the alliance and helping species understand each other," and Seraphine shook her head, and said, "I mean with each other, and what are your intentions?" "Oh," and Lyra said, and her cheeks colored slightly, and Jake cleared his throat, and said, "We love each other and we want to be together, but we have not talked about marriage or anything formal," and Seraphine laughed and said, "You should." In Reach culture, when a princess chooses a partner, it is significant, and it makes statements and sends messages, and Seraphine said, "And if you two formalize your relationship, it will strengthen the alliance and show that humans and Reach can truly unite." "Are you saying we should get married for political reasons?" and Lyra asked sharply, and Seraphine said, "No, daughter. And I am saying you should get married because you love each other, and the political benefits are a bonus." Jake said, "Marriage is a big step, and we have only been together a few months," and Seraphine smiled and said, "You have been together since he rescued you, and you just did not realize it. And besides, you two are bonded, and anyone can see it." Lyra looked at Jake and said she is right and we are bonded, and I cannot imagine my life without you, and Jake felt his heart swell, and said I cannot imagine mine without you either, and so yes, and let us do this, and let us get married. Seraphine looked pleased and said good, and I will handle the arrangements, and it will be a celebration and a symbol in humans, and reach united in the most fundamental way, and she left them alone. Jake and Lyra sat in stunned silence and then started laughing, and Jake said, "Did we just agree to get married because your mother told us to?" And Lyra said, "I think we did. And but also because we want to," and Jake said, "Yes, and definitely because we want to." The wedding was planned for 3 months later, and it became a massive event, and representatives from every Alliance species attended, an Earth orbit filled with ships, and the ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy. Lyra wore traditional Reach robes and mixed with human elements, and she was breathtaking, and Jake wore formal military dress, and with Reach symbols added, and Ember was there, and wearing a tiny ceremonial collar and looking proud. They spoke vows in both languages and promised to honor and protect and love each other. And when they kissed, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and across human space, and Reach territory celebrations began. The reception lasted for days, and there was food and music and dancing, and different species shared their cultures, and Jake danced with Lyra and held her close, and said, "I cannot believe this is real." Lyra smiled and said, "It is real, and we are married, and you are stuck with me now," and Jake said, "Good, and I would not want it any other way," and they kissed again, and Ember chirped happily. Weeks later they moved into quarters together and combined their belongings, and it was strange and wonderful, and Ember claimed the best sleeping spot, and refused to move, and they laughed and worked around her. Life continued, and they still worked building the alliance, and now as a married couple, and their example inspired others, and more interspecies relationships formed, and the galaxy became more connected. One night they lay in bed and talked about the future, and Lyra said, "Do you ever think about children?" and Jake was quiet and said, "I do. And do you think it is possible in humans and Reach having children together?" "I do not know," and Lyra said, "and but Reach geneticists say it might be, and with some help, and would you want that?" And Jake turned to look at her and said, "Yes, and I would, and very much," and Lyra smiled and said, "Then we will find out." Months passed, and then a year, and the alliance was strong and growing, and new technologies emerged, and trade flourished, and conflicts were resolved through dialogue, and the galaxy was changing. Jake and Lyra stood on the observation deck, and their spot, and watched Earth turn, and Lyra was pregnant, and showing now and Reach geneticists had helped, and said the baby would be healthy and unique, and the first of a new generation. Jake put his hand on her stomach and felt movement, and Lyra covered his hand with hers, and said, "Our child will grow up in a galaxy where species work together, and where anything is possible," and Jake said, "Because of what we built." "Because of what we all built," and Lyra corrected, "and because people chose hope over fear," and Ember chirped from her perch, and had grown even larger and more magnificent, and the dragon would protect this baby fiercely. The future stretched ahead and full of challenges, and but also full of promise, and Jake, who had once been just a scout pilot, had helped change the galaxy, and Lyra Silverwing, who had once been a runaway princess, had found a home. Their story would be told for generations, and the princess saved by a human, and the queen who claimed him, and the alliance they built together. And but for them, it was not a legend or a tale. It was simply their life and their love and their family, and it was everything they needed. Years would pass, and their child would grow, and more children would follow, and the alliance would face threats and overcome them, and humans and Reach and others would continue learning and growing together. And through it all, Jake and Lyra would stand together, and with Ember beside them, and with the love of two peoples, and with the knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can do is reach out to a stranger and offer help. Because that single act of kindness, and that moment when Jake chose to save a dying woman in a crystal pod, and had changed everything, and had built bridges between worlds, and had proven that different species could not just coexist but thrive. The stars waited and full of wonder and mystery and adventure, and the Alliance was ready, and together they would face whatever came, and they would do it with courage and hope and love. And that was enough, and that was everything.